I'm Alice. I'm an expert, I guess, in business and human rights and social impact, and I'm kind of here to some extent to address the balance of the dialogue today, because I would suggest that perhaps about 80%, possibly even 90% of what we've talked about this morning has been environmental focused and less about the S in ESG, and that's what I'm here to talk about. I think for many businesses, the perception is still that the S is somewhat neglected and it's mystifying, and businesses don't really understand the route in. Firstly, and speaking to Ben's points about perhaps the direction of travel, I just want to kind of contextualize this a little bit. So the principles around the proper treatment of people stem from the Bill of Human Rights, the ILO core conventions, and more recently, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, as well as national law and how those instruments are translated into national law. Ben mentioned the EU taxonomy, so there is also a social taxonomy within the EU taxonomy, and that's really looking at three stakeholder groups. So employees with value chain workers wrapped into that. Sorry, I'm losing myself. Customers and sustainable and inclusive economies. This is further broken down by the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or the ESRS, just another acronym if you weren't feeling like you'd had enough. And these underpin the basis of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. But what we're really seeing here from a social perspective is the translation of the UNGPs from soft law, so it's a non-binding framework, into hard law. And we're going to see that direction of travel in legislation, I think, over the next few years. So in addition to more reporting standards, what we're also seeing coming through is mandated action. So Ben also mentioned the CSDDD, or the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and that is going to mandate the actions that companies need to be taking from an environmental and a social perspective. And prior to the name CSDDD, the community that was sort of lobbying for this were calling this mandatory human rights due diligence. So ultimately what we're seeing is an increasing duty to report, but we're also seeing a duty to act within the legislation. And I think it's really important for organisations to understand that, because you're all going to have to respond to it. So the hospitality sector, it's an absolutely vital sector. It provides millions of jobs and opportunities for communities worldwide. It provides economic development. It contributes to the growth of SMEs. We've seen cultural exchange, people learning about other cultures because of hospitality and because of the tourism industry. And we've also seen community development, so opportunities for small businesses, local charities and initiatives to actually develop and gain more income because of the tourism industry. But at the same time as that, of those positive impacts, there are also negative impacts. Exploitation of workers, displacement of local communities, overcrowding and strain on resources, and so it goes on. And it's really important for businesses to try to understand that at the same time as having positive impacts, you can also have negative impacts. And this is really, really key. The key to understanding these negative impacts is stakeholder engagement, and that is going to be part of this direction of travel in the legislation. So it's going to require companies to be able to disclose how they talk to the different stakeholder groups and communities that they operate within, what they did with that information in order to maximize positive impacts and minimize negative impacts. The new standards that are emerging are going to really require companies to more formally disclose what they're doing to mitigate, prevent, and remedy where negative impacts occur. And that's particularly in reference to the UNGPs, that particular language. The last few years have demonstrated, like no other time, the business case, I think, for both environmental but also social responsibility. The pandemic shone a spotlight on employee and guest welfare, as well as the resilience of supply chains. And James, I think, quite helpfully spoke about how supply chains are recovering today. Many of you will have experienced issues with labour shortage. So recruitment, retention, and development of the people working for you have been more important than ever. With the cost of living crisis and high inflation, we've seen increased employee demands for responsible employers. And I think that that is only going to increase with Generation X coming through. Certainly my children are asking about social responsibility more and more. Perhaps that's just because I'm their mum and I talk about these things. But I do think there is going to be a reset, a much needed rebalancing in hospitality of focus between guest and employees and other stakeholder communities, because after all, it's these communities that provide your resilience. So whether you use the terms social impact, human rights, labour standards, all of them are interconnected, but in the business context, they are a little bit alienating. So I would suggest that for all of you businesses, what you need to be thinking about is the topics. So not the principles, but the topics that are actually going to help make your businesses more resilient. And actually, if you start thinking about topics, it is easier to access the real impacts. So really, this should be a holistic approach to people across the sector. And it's through this social and human capital that you are generating your financial capital. And the kinds of topics that you need to be thinking about and may well already be working on are health, safety and welfare, diversity, equity and inclusion, workforce engagement, fair labour and community engagement. At the Social Impact Committee, which I chair at the EEA, our mission is to try and help support and deliver a standard that is going to enable the hotel community, the hospitality community, to measure social impact in the sector. Some of the key factors that we're going to be considering are the regulatory environment, alignment with standards, the requirements of investors, and also what does that broader stakeholder landscape look like, and what are the metrics that are going to be required to demonstrate those impacts. So in terms of the regulatory environment, this will be about ensuring that we map the work to legislation. We need to be considering both what is in play today, but also what's the direction of travel and what are you going to need to be responding to in the future. And actually it is relatively clear. And then we're also going to aim to cover UK and European legislation as a start, bearing in mind that much of this is going to have an influence, particularly from the social perspective, on what happens in other jurisdictions. We're going to seek to ensure that we align our measurement criteria, and I think Janine mentioned this as well. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. There are many, many metrics out there already, and there are probably metrics that you are to some extent gathering. So this really is about working with the standard setters, or at least learning from the standard setters, to ensure that the way that we are measuring impact in the hospitality industry aligns with those standards and therefore makes it easier for your business to respond when your investors or your other stakeholders ask for information. We also want the hospitality sector to be able to compete with other sectors. And this is really, really key, because I think, the perception, whether or not it's true, the perception is that hospitality is somewhere behind. And I don't think that is necessarily true, but we need to be able to demonstrate that, and we need to be able to demonstrate that through quantifiable and qualitative information. We also want to engage with investors to understand what they need to know when they are making investments, or when businesses want to be able to access social finance products, of which I believe some are starting to emerge. So to do this, we are going to be looking to develop a means to measure impact across 4 key groups. So employees, guests, value chain workers, and communities. And what we'll then do is look to apply salient topics across each of those areas. So the types of topics that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Some of these categories are going to be cross-cutting, right? So, for instance, if we take modern slavery, we know that modern slavery can occur in any one of those 4 areas, okay? So some of these will be cross-cutting. Or if you take mental health and well-being, for many people, the reason they access hospitality is because they want to improve their mental health. They want to have fun, right? But it is also an impact because of costs related to mental health, stress, and leave. We're going to try to ensure that the metrics that we set drive positive impact rather than negative impact, or at least enable the differentiation between the two. And so, for instance, on mental health, it's not what was provided to support mental health of your employees, but did this result in a reduction of sick days, for example? The other example would be training. How many of you have put in a report, we've trained 200 people on X topic? Well, actually, the key question is not how many you've trained, but what was the outcome that resulted from the training? What did you actually achieve? Another area as well, grievance mechanisms. This is going to be part of the direction of travel for legislation. It's already being baked in. An interesting situation occurred with a client where they wanted to include their whistleblowing helpline in their disclosures. And when we rang the phone number, we got through to a dental health sales unit. And so this is just a little bit of proof that, you know, you can put these systems in place, but if you aren't checking that they're healthy, if you haven't got the right governance in place to support these systems, you don't actually know whether or not they are working. I think it's really important as well, just from a stakeholder point of view, because I think for a lot of people this becomes quite mystifying. How do I engage with stakeholders? How do I talk with local community? So we will be looking at measures to identify this, whether that's employee engagement surveys, guest satisfaction, or indeed how you engage with the local community. And I think the really key thing to say, it is both what you engage on and how this engagement led to improved outcomes that's going to be really important. Data has been mentioned a little bit this morning, but this is really, really, really essential. I can't stress it enough. If you are not thinking quite carefully about how you are mapping and tracking both your social and environmental data today, then I suggest you start thinking it as soon as you leave this conference tomorrow. Mandated sustainability disclosures and social disclosures are coming, and so is assurance. So you're going to need to be sure that you have an auditable data trail that you can share with auditors who are going to be able to track the impacts that you're disclosing. Many of you will already have realised the value that people bring to your business, and others have had other priorities that have come in the way. But whichever driver it is that makes you pick up the banner of ESG and start thinking about how you implement in your business, I would suggest it's better to start sooner rather than later, rather than waiting for the requirements of legislation, investors and other stakeholders. It will probably be too late. So consolidate what you're doing under the S in ESG. Consider consulting stakeholders much more deeply, set metrics to measure your performance, and design systems to capture data to enable you to robustly report. This is going to make you better able to respond, more assurance ready, and ultimately it will increase your business resilience because it's the people in your business that are making your business great. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Well done.